All right, it's good to be here with you all. I have thoroughly enjoyed this weekend. I have thoroughly enjoyed getting to know this congregation. I just have to say, you might be a congregation of 45 or something like that, but y'all sound like a congregation of 200. So that is definitely an encouragement, a congregation that although small in number, it is clear that the passion that you have for Jesus is expressed in your singing. So thank you for edifying me this weekend. As you remember, when we were doing our atheist role play, Aaron mentioned certain things about the resurrection. Asked the question, well, how do you know that it simply wasn't a copycat resurrection? Or how do you know that this event even took place? And we just sung an amazing song that talks about that Jesus rose from the grave. But the skeptic would say, or did he? How do you know that? Are you sure? And the common answer that we give, well, because it's in the Bible. But what if we could step into the atheist worldview, or maybe not even the atheist worldview? What if we could just use the tools of history and establish that it's more probable than not that Jesus rose from the grave shortly after he died? That'll be the subject of this lesson. Did Jesus rise from the grave? Now, we affirm yes. But I want to ask the question, well, how do you know that? What if you were in a conversation with somebody who was a skeptic or somebody who was sincerely doubting their faith and said, well, how would you show me that outside of, well, the Bible says so? Right? That's what we want to look at. Now, the resurrection is certainly important for a number of reasons. One, it says something about Jesus. If Jesus rose from the grave, and he said that he was going to rise from the grave, then that makes him more than just a really cool dude that walked around Palestine, right? It makes him more than just a good teacher, right? It makes him not only a prophet, but it definitely makes him somebody who's claimed to be divine, someone who claimed to be divine, and that turns out to be true. It says something about God. If the resurrection is true, then it seems to me that a divine being exists, because a resurrection is a miracle, and miracles don't happen naturally, they happen supernaturally. So it seems that this leads us down the path of, well, God exists. It says something about Christianity, that Christianity just isn't part of the seafood buffet of beliefs that you get to choose from as you walk down the aisle of life, so to speak. It makes Christianity unique. It separates Christianity from all other religions that have been, will be, or are to come. It makes Christianity exclusive, right? That's the thing about Christianity. It is exclusive, but it's also inclusive. It proclaims this objective truth, but allows anybody from any background to join. Right? So it says something about Christianity. It is the focus of the New Testament. There are over 300 verses in the New Testament that refer to the resurrection of Jesus. If someone asks you, hey, what is the New Testament all about? Well, you look at it and say the resurrection of Jesus. 300 verses that speak to that as well. Almost 20 times in the New Testament, we're told that believers will be raised like Jesus. You think the authors of the New Testament focused on the resurrection, and that was the central thing that was on their mind when they wrote? Absolutely, positively. But the question we want to ask is the resurrection true or false? Because Paul mentions that if the resurrection did not happen, our faith is futile. So this is what we want to accomplish here in the time that we have together. We want to utilize an approach that will meet the non-believer where they are by making a historical case for the resurrection. I'll introduce the minimal facts to the resurrection, and then I'll answer the main objections to the minimal facts for the resurrection. But notice, And that Paul says this is in vain if it didn't happen. And so here are the minimal facts that we want to look at. Now, by minimal facts, I mean these are facts that are agreed upon by New Testament scholars of all stripes, whether they are Jewish New Testament scholars, Muslim New Testament scholars, skeptical New Testament scholars, or Christians who happen to study the New Testament. 90% agreement across the board on these facts. And the first one you see there is that Jesus died by crucifixion at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Fact number 2, shortly after the death of Jesus, his tomb was found empty. And then 3, the disciples of Jesus believed that they had seen the risen Jesus. And I need to adjust that. That's 75%, not 90%, 75%. So let's take a look at each one of these. Now, before we get into this, there's something that I need to tell you about that I mentioned as Aaron the Atheist. So the things that I mentioned as Aaron the Atheist in my role play, I try to answer those throughout the seminar. I don't want to leave you guessing. And one of those is that the resurrection of Jesus was somehow a copycat resurrection from other ancient Near Eastern or Mediterranean religious beliefs. Well, that's patently false, and here's a couple of reasons why. Number one, the stories of resurrection of the ancient Near East or Mediterranean religions don't look anything like the resurrection of Jesus. Let me give you an example. So there's a resurrection story of Osiris, who's an ancient Egyptian god. And Osiris is killed by his brother Set. And Set chops up his brother into 14 pieces and spreads his body across the world. Then, this is really weird for a Sunday morning worship service, isn't it? You don't get that usually with the price of admission. And so Isis, Osiris's wife/sister, goes and collects 13 pieces of Osiris's body, resuscitates Osiris, and then Osiris takes his place as the Lord of the underworld. Now, let me ask you a question here. Does that look anything like what we have in the Gospels? Not even close, right? The second thing that we need to look at with regards to the resurrection stories is that the vast majority of the resurrection stories of the ancient Near East or the Mediterranean religions, these resurrections are connected with agricultural cycles of the time. So God A rises and dies as a sign that the harvest is on the way. But Jesus' resurrection is nowhere near connected to these agricultural cycles of the time. So we need to understand that as well. And I think one of the bigger issues here is that Christianity has its roots in Judaism. What I mean by that is the Old Testament prophesies and points to the coming and the messianic prophecies of Jesus. Well, why is that important? Because if we remember the Jews in the Old Testament, what was their biggest issue? Their biggest issue in the Old Testament was they wanted to adopt every god that came their way. Right? We see in Ezekiel, in Ezekiel chapter 16, I believe, where God says that they played the harlot with every passerby. Well, it wasn't just every political alliance that came by. It was every religion that came by. We see shortly after the Exodus from Egypt, what is Aaron doing while Moses is getting the Ten Commandments from God? Well, he's fashioning an idol. And so we see that in the Old Testament. The problem with the Jews is they're adopting way too many gods. And so they are thrown into Babylonian captivity for 70 years. And then by the time we come to the New Testament, their issue isn't adopting a bunch of gods, is that they don't want to accept anybody. Think about their relationship with the Samaritans. Why did they not like the Samaritans? Because the Samaritans were half Jewish, half Gentile, and they didn't want the Gentile influence depurifying, right, or diluting Judaism. So why is that important? Because we see in the New Testament that the Jews are not adopting gods. They're not adopting new religious figures. So the fact that 3,000 Jews converted to Christianity on the day of Pentecost is not because they're willing to adopt new religious figures. There has to be something to that, Right? Their disposition of their mind is not one of, let's be eclectic, let's be pluralistic. It's, no, we're keeping everything out. And so the disposition of the newest converts in Christianity is not one of, hey, let's just adopt a new religious system. So that plays a part in why the resurrection of Jesus, those are just three basic facts of why the resurrection of Jesus is different than these ancient Near Eastern Mediterranean religions, which means, in all likelihood, in all probability, it's not a copycat. Okay? So now that we have that out of the way, let's look at these minimal facts. First fact, that Jesus died by crucifixion at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Now, his death is multiply attested by ancient sources, both Christian and non-Christian. We have the four Gospels, as we're going to see here, the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15. But we also see that men like Tacitus and Mara bar Serapion and Lucian, they're all aware that this has taken place. And all of these are non-Christian sources. Here's John Dominic Croston, who's a member of the Jesus Seminar. Now, if you know anything about the Jesus Seminar, I don't know if it's disbanded or not, but they believe that a large majority of the things that Jesus says in the New Testament, he really didn't say in the New Testament, right? So they're on the skeptical side of the equation. But notice what he says. Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical could ever be. For if no follower of Jesus had written anything for 100 years after his crucifixion, we would still know about him from two authors among his supporters. Their names are Flavius Josephus and Cornelius Tacitus. Now, what's significant about those sources? They're not Campbellites. That's a joke. You can laugh at that. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Some of you don't. Right? One's a Jew, right? And the other one is a Roman. Two groups of people who historically are all for Christianity. Right? No, not at all. So that's significant coming from John Dominic Crossan. So his death by crucifixion is established as a historical fact. Why is that important? Because you can't have a resurrection without a death, right? Dead people don't, or alive people don't resurrect, only dead people do. Just so you know, right? Number two, shortly after Jesus' death, his tomb was found empty. So if the story of Jesus' entombment is accurate, then the location of Jesus' tomb must have been known when the disciples began to preach the resurrection. And it must have been known to be empty. Well, why is that significant? Because Jesus had been crucified where? In Jerusalem, the same place where the message of his resurrection began. It would have been idiotic. Can I say stupid? Am I allowed to say that? All right, stupid, foolish, to preach that a man rose from the dead when people knew that his tomb was occupied. The same place where the resurrection story begins is the same place where Jesus is buried. Think about this for a second. Peter stands up on the day of Pentecost and says, he rose from the dead. And all the Jews look and say, his body's right there. It's in the same city. And here's the thing. The Jews would have known where the body was laid because all Gospels, all accounts of Jesus' burial point to Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, burying Jesus. Right? So the Jews know where the body is. And who followed Joseph of Arimathea? Women who were disciples of Jesus. So the disciples knew where it was. Right? And we'll get that later. Plus, the burial of Jesus meets the criterion of early attestation, as all Gospels, like I said, say that Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was the site of Jesus' burial. Now, this is most likely not an early fiction, because you don't let the member of the council that condemned your leader bury your leader, regardless if he's a follower, right? You just don't let that happen. Now, here's the question. Why is it left to Joseph of Arimathea to bury Jesus? Because the disciples are nowhere to be found. And in order to keep the land pure, according to Deuteronomy, cursed is the one who hangs on a tree. This is the time of the Passover. The Jews want the land to be pure. Well, what do they have to do? They've got to get Jesus off that cross. Regardless of what they think about him, they got to get him off that cross so that the land can remain pure. And every specific detail about the burial of Jesus, with the linen wrappings and the spices that were offered, meet what took place traditionally under Jewish burial rites. And so we see that Joseph of Arimathea was most likely not an invention, and that his tomb was known by both the disciples and the Jews. But also, the tomb was discovered by women. Now, once again, for those ladies who have walked in possibly, or who are watching online possibly, don't throw cabbage at your screen if you're watching online. Don't throw any cabbage at me. I'm just the messenger here. All right. Women were not regarded as credible witnesses, as Josephus records, right? Happy is he whose children are male, but unhappy is he whose children are female. That's how it was looked at, ladies. Sorry. Remember, just the messenger. So I only bring that quote in, not to disparage women, but to show you not only the place and the attitude towards women in the first century, but then ask the question, well, if that's the case, then why do the gospel authors stay with women being at the tomb first and discovering it empty? Why not just erase them out of history and put somebody else there? Put Joseph of Arimathea there, right? That would probably be a more convincing case, right? Joseph of Arimathea, the guy from the Sanhedrin, finds the tomb empty. But each gospel that records the empty tomb scenario stays with the women. So we have that as a minimal fact. And then 3, the disciples of Jesus believed that they saw the risen Christ. So we have Jesus dying by crucifixion. His tomb was empty. And then the disciples of Jesus believe that they saw him. So this is interesting because we see in 1 Corinthians 15 this creed that comes up. There's a scripture reading that was very well done. And that it reads, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." Notice, when Paul gives a directive throughout his writings, he is emphatic. He says things like, "I urge you to do these things," or "I have heard from Chloe's people that this is what's going on." But here he says, "I'm delivering you something that I got." Right? So it's not original with Paul. He says that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, from whom most remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Now, what's interesting, I have these things highlighted here, because the delivery and receiving there is first century creedal terminology. And notice there are a couple of sets of significant language markers here. Notice he says that Christ, and that he was buried, and that he was raised, and that he appeared. Those are creedal bullet points, ladies and gentlemen. That he, that he, that he, that he. Then notice the second set of bullet points. Then to the 12, then he appeared, then to James, then to all the apostles. So this is going to sound weird, okay, but just bear with me. So you have a set of 4 that's, and then a set of 4 thens. Now, why is that there? So the person who would recite the creed could follow the creed systematically. All right, here comes the first that, the second that, the third that, the fourth that. The first then, the second then, the third then, the fourth then. This is how people remembered creeds. And so you might ask the question, well, how come there's no mention of the women? Or how come there's no mention of the empty tomb? Or how come there's no mention of some things that happened after Jesus rose from the dead? Well, that's not the nature of creeds, brothers and sisters. The nature of creeds is to capture the gist of the historical event, so that the gist of the historical event can be passed down from person to person, from family to family. Everybody following with that? Everybody understand that? Okay, cool. So there's some other things here that help us know that it's a creed. Well, the Corinthians were primarily a Gentile group of people, but here we see that Paul calls Peter by his Aramaic name, right? Cephas. So why would you call Peter by his Jewish name to a group of Gentiles? Well, you wouldn't unless you were reciting a creed. And so most scholars believe that this dates between 3 and 5 years after the resurrection, and originated in Jerusalem with the early church. So that's really cool, because what do we have? We have 4 Gospels that date within 100 years, within 60 years of Jesus' life, and then an early oral creed that dates between 3 and 5 years of Jesus' death. Well, why is that significant? Because embellishment and legend are not allowed to creep in. We have something that's this early, which points to the historicity of the event. That the event that is taking place, that's being talked about, actually happened. All right. So, the number one rejoinder of this, or number one objection to these appearances, is someone might say, well, how do you know that the disciples didn't just have a mass hallucination and they believed that they saw Jesus, but they really didn't see Jesus? That's the number one objection. It's called the hallucination theory. Well, let's look at the nature of hallucinations real quick. They are mind-dependent and cannot be shared. They're much like dreams, right? So I couldn't awake one night and tell my wife Hillary, who, hi, I love you, say, hey, I'm dreaming that I'm in the Bahamas. Go to sleep and join me. We could really use a free vacation. If that were possible, man, I would never wake up, right? I'd just be surfing the waves in Hawaii, hanging out in the Bahamas. But I can't do that. Anybody here ever have the experience where you feel like your phone is ringing, but it's really not? That's a type of hallucination. That's a tactile hallucination. Anybody here? This is one that this is one that everybody likes. Ever been asleep on the bed and feel like you're falling off the bed, but you really don't? You wake up, you're like, whoa, I almost fell off the bed, but you're like 3 feet from the edge, right? That's a type of hallucination, right? Anybody here ever hear the doorbell ringing, but then it really hasn't rung? You ask, hey, who's at the door? And you're like, what are you talking about? Right? You get that really weird, awkward conversation with your spouse. Those are types of hallucination. But here's the thing. I can't share any one of those hallucinations with my spouse or my friend. Right? I could never look at David and be like, hey man, did you hear my phone ringing in your back pocket? Oh, of course not, right? Or roll over one night and look at your wife and say, did you almost feel me fall off the bed? Well, no, of course not. Right? Well, what about these types of hallucinations where these visual hallucinations where I'm seeing somebody? Well, those things can't be shared either. They're much like dreams. And also, hallucinations last seconds, not hours or days. Remember, as we look at the gospel data, we see that Jesus appears in many different places at many different times, doing many different things, right? On the road to Emmaus, he's talking to 2 disciples, asking, hey, what's all the buzz about, right? With Thomas, he appears to them, and he appears to Thomas and says, hey, put your hand in my wounds. My favorite one is at the end of the Gospel of John, where they're out there fishing, and Jesus is already on the bank cooking breakfast, right? Fish fillet with Jesus. That would be really amazing, right? And so it's not as if Jesus is just stationary, but Jesus is speaking, he's talking, he's walking, and he's appearing to different groups of disciples at different times. So what does that mean? Right? Well, 15% of the general population will experience that type of hallucination at some point in their life. But in order for this hallucination theory to work, 100% of the disciples had to experience an individual hallucination at the same place at the same time. They had to do what was statistically impossible every single time this appearance is recorded. You ever thought about that? That's wild. That 15% of the general population will have this visual type of hallucination. But in order for the hallucination theory to hold, every time that Jesus appears to the disciples, it's not just that one disciple had to have a hallucination. It's that all disciples had to have the exact same hallucination at the exact same place at the exact same time. So what does that mean when we look at something like 1 Corinthians 15 and 500 brothers saw Jesus at the exact same time. That means that 500 people at the same place at the same time did what is statistically impossible. It doesn't seem to add up. And then one other objection that's often, a couple other objections that are often offered with regards to the empty tomb is that they went to the wrong tomb. And they saw that it was empty and they thought that it was Jesus' tomb. Well, here's the problem with that. As we've mentioned, the Jews knew where the tomb was and the disciples knew where the tomb was. And if Matthew's account about Roman guards is correct, then the Romans knew where the tomb was. And so for the disciples to go to the wrong tomb, that means that at least two other groups of people knew where the right tomb was and they could have just shown the body. Right? How come the body is never presented as a counterfactual to the claim Jesus rose from the dead? Well, if the wrong tomb theory is right, well, then the disciples missed it, the Jews missed it, and the Romans missed it. So everybody had a mass case of collective amnesia and forgot where the tomb was. Right? Or what if they might say something, something to the effect of, well, they went to the wrong tomb, or the disciples stole the body. Well, what's the disposition of the disciples shortly after Jesus' death? It's not to go, let's find the body. It's let's go fishing, guys. He's not the Messiah. It's not only after the resurrection appearances take place that the disciples become emboldened, right? And start preaching the resurrection as well. So that's just a tidbit there. So here's the thing about your life that you need to understand, is that Jesus is the answer key. That as we've looked this weekend, we've looked at things like, well, how do I know that God exists? We've looked at things like the Kalam cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, the moral argument. We looked at the historical reliability of the New Testament, and we've looked at the historicity of the resurrection. And my question is this for us. How's that going to change your Monday? How's that going to change the conversation that you have with people at work? What is that going to do for your marriage? How's that going to impact the type of conversations you have with your kids or your grandkids? And maybe more important than all of that, how's that going to change the way you approach engaging people in this city for the cause of Christ? Because here's the thing, and I don't want to be too hard on you guys. We don't know each other overly well, but I guess that's the beauty of what I do. I can just say whatever I need to say and leave, and if you don't want me to have me back, then I just never come back, right? We can talk about the evidence for the resurrection. We can talk about God's existence. We can talk about the historical reliability of the New Testament. But if it doesn't galvanize you and convict you even more to open your mouths and talk to people in this city about what they need, namely Jesus as their Savior, then we've wasted our time this weekend. And you can even go online and you can say, oh, well, they got these cool blogs and they got this free online course. But if it doesn't move you in your relationship with Jesus and with God, if it doesn't cause you as a group to come closer together for the mission of Christ, then guess what? Let's just do what the disciples did after they thought Jesus was dead. Let's just go fish. But I would say that because this information is true, you and I now have an obligation to fish for humans. So let's do that. And maybe this morning you're one of the people that's doubted or has serious concerns and serious doubts about your faith. Guess what? I don't leave until tomorrow. I'd be more than happy to sit down and talk with you. And I know there's a group of people here that would love to have a conversation with you about Jesus, the Christ, and His church. Maybe you're a skeptic and this is the first time you've heard that information. My prayer is that you seriously consider the evidence for God, the New Testament, and the resurrection of Jesus. Let's consider those things this morning as we stand and as we sing.